Since this week is about a terrible tasting spirit that was regularly mixed with all sorts of things to make it drinkable, on a whim, I wanted to mention proof syrup, which is made by a friend from that boucherie I went to in Georgia. As one of the chefs there, he was giving me samples of all these really tasty cocktails made with their proof syrup as I ran around all day solving problems and learning how to properly twist sausages. Since it's made in Georgia, proof uses lots of flavors and ingredients from the Southeast: orange, pecan, bacon, peach, walnut, along with other botanicals. I can't get you a taste of the boudin or the gratin or the lard-roasted peanuts or the head cheese, but you can pick up the basis of a really nice cocktail with the proof syrup. And I'm sure it would even make the patently awful 17th century rum taste better. But I recommend something nicer. Oh, and something like the passion fruit and ginger syrups also make a nice fancy soda on their own. Anyway, if you want a taste of proof syrup, since I can't share the delicious pork experience, they're around in stores, but also available online at proofsyrup.com. Episode 37. Rum, the most profitable industrial waste of the 17th century. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at Kill Devil, or as we know it today, rum, and how it was, to paraphrase Homer Simpson, the solution to and the cause of so many problems. Distilled alcohol was known, imported, yet rare and expensive at the start of the 17th century in the British Atlantic colonies. Molasses, the industrial waste I refer to in the title, would change all that. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that by the 17th century, making alcoholic beverages and even distilled liquors from sugar refining were not new things, but the industrial scale it was developing into in the 17th century was. As I've addressed in episodes like Chains and Sugar, the world along the Atlantic Ocean was rearranging. For several centuries, most markets had been very local. A few fancy specialty items like silk or cloves or precious gems or sandalwood, preserved fish, fancy hams, and particular metal-worked items might be transported over long distances, but for the most part, a few days away was as far as most products got. Up until the 16th century, distilled spirits had largely been local products sold at high prices and consumed sparingly in medicinal quantities, and mostly by fairly fancy people. Just about anyone could, and did, make alcoholic fermented beverages from just about anything that contained any of the OS sugars. But taking it that next step and concentrating the alcohol through distillation required leaps in technology and resources. So I keep using the word industrial. In the modern world, this usually conjures visions of naked steel beams, clanking hot factories, smoking furnaces, and workers cramped together side by side in giant warehouse spaces doing repetitive jobs. And for those of us of a certain age, a genre of music that can be both a bit embarrassing and hard to explain. There is lots that is still true about this vision in its 17th century version. Setting the musical genre aside, the main differences come down to, and I was actually surprised by this, only the lack of large pieces of metal and the involvement of fossil fuels. The crowding was there, the repetitiveness was there, even the smoking furnaces. Just all the motive power was human and animal muscle with occasional additions of wind and water. Any machines were mostly wood, and the furnaces burned trees, or in the case of sugar and molasses, pressed sugar cane and other plant waste. When I'm using the word industrial, it refers to a manufacturing process that is completely self-contained and exclusive. Considerations about what it takes to get the raw materials was not considered beyond making it as cheap as possible. And anything produced beside the desired product was seen as waste that needed disposing of. Connections to the surrounding environment were ignored. It also refers to a location being used to exclusively process one thing and not for local use. The workers received no direct benefit from the product. The workers, in fact, were as much a part of the machine as the presses or the boiling vats, the machetes, or the draining cones. While a blacksmith would use his own wares, or a cheesemaker fed her family and sold the excess, or even the mantua maker, even if not wearing any of the robes she made, had relationships with the customers. Before industrial scale, there was workshop scale, that step up from an individual artisan doing every part of the work. And even for the high volume, for the 17th century items that came from workshops, there would be familial and at least theoretical, if tenuous, obligations of duty from the master to the journeymen, apprentices, shop servants, siblings, cousins, wives, and children working in the shop. And in the workshop setting, individuals were expected to be skilled, and they would complete large portions of any object or project they were assigned to. In the industrial setting, work was more constricted, broken into smaller chunks, and most importantly, was, at least theoretically, unskilled. Anyone, again, in theory, could simply be tossed into a role with minimal training and become a productive cog in the machine. Time and time again, then and now, this proves to be untrue. But for the men at the top working on problems like, say, emptying the streets of grubby urchins or looking to expand the sales range for wool cloth and iron tools, the realities on the ground, or the shop floor, often mattered little. By all these definitions, by the middle of the 17th century, the sugar trade had reached industrial scales in the Western Atlantic. The Portuguese started things in what would become Brazil, and the Spanish did a bit, but mountains made of basically solid silver distracted them. The Dutch set up sugar plantations on the north coast of South America, and the English set up on Barbados after, quote, discovering the island when Sir John Sumner was shipwrecked on it. They later expanded to several islands, including Jamaica. The French claimed much of Santo Domingo from the Spanish and set up the plantation society of Saint-Domingue that would eventually become Haiti. And I have to put a serious and completely unsolicited plug for the Revolutions podcast series on Haiti. Just go listen. So everyone was making sugar, and the men at the top were making money hand over fist, shipping barrels and barrels of sugar cones back to Europe and a few up the coast of North America. But there was a problem, a dark, sticky, gooey problem. Sugar is made by boiling down the juice squeezed out of the sugarcane grass. Even when it is boiled down enough to make sugar crystals, they exist in a goopy, dark, sweet syrup. For every 2 measures of sugar crystals, the producers are left with 1 measure of molasses. When the very whitest sugar was made, it was closer to 4 measures of sugar to 3 measures of molasses. Or think of it as 1 to 0.5 molasses and 1 to 0.75 molasses, respectively. In the sugar houses of the 17th century, the sugar was scooped out and drained of the dark molasses, and then sometimes whitened further with the addition of clay and bone ashes. But that goop in the kettles the sugar was scooped from, well, some of it made a pretty nice syrup, and that was barreled and sold as a sort of honey replacement. Versions of it even exist today as things like golden syrup and treacle. But after the nice syrup was taken out, there was still more goo. And it was thick and dark, and due to being cooked so long, the minerals from the sugarcane juice were concentrated, and it could have a bitter or even sort of salty-ish taste mixed in with the sweet. No matter how long this goo was cooked, it never crystallized. It might mostly solidify into this sort of creepy, sticky, useless black mass, but after all the good stuff was extracted, why waste wood to heat it anymore? It was waste. When the sugar plantations went full industrial, they were completely monocropping situations. The big house might have a kitchen garden, but for just about everyone else, all food was imported, since Food farming would take away from sugar production, which was where the money was. So this waste goo, the molasses, wasn't fed to chickens or pigs or any other livestock as it is today. Rather, it was dumped in the ocean. In the 17th century, visitors to Sugar Islands would note these dark, sticky rivers running to the sea, creating dark, dead spots in the coral reefs that surrounded the islands. This seems to be the first recorded environmental damage caused by industrial waste in the Caribbean. But in a society that had fully bought into the idea that there was always a way to send problematic things to, waste, criminals, religious dissenters, and so on, the molasses rivers were more of a curiosity than a problem. If anything, it was the foremen and the accountants who saw simply dumping the molasses as a problem. That was really expensive waste in terms of time, effort, and good coined silver that had gone into purchasing the indentured servants and later slaves that produced that goo. A few other solutions were tried, including using it in the mortar in the buildings on the islands. That, along with a few other schemes, was a failure. But soon, the ultimate profitable use for molasses was found. If there's one thing an island had in the 17th century, it was sailors. Life on Navy and merchant ships largely consisted of tedious busy work, long periods of boredom, fairly terrible food, various levels of hunger, and pretty hellish conditions when in storms and battles. In the absence of some good Netflix or Candy Crush or manga comics to lose oneself in, hitting land was a great time to get falling down, blackout drunk for several days and absolutely forgetting everything one had been through. Ports around the world offered a wide array of tipples to accomplish this end. While wine of grape and other fruits and beers were common enough, by the 17th century, distillation had broken out of Central Asia, and a variety of fortified drinks were also starting to show up in seaside taverns and on board ships outside of the doctor's kit. The globe-trotting sailor would have encountered the arracks, grappas, brandies, whiskeys, wines fortified with extra alcohol, mezcals, and possibly sojus as they moved about the world. These distilled beverages had their bases in sugar syrups, sweet saps, grapes and other fermented fruits, fermented wheat and barley mashes, agave sap, and rice mashes. This is, of course, not a complete list, but it covers the broad categories. And if sampling the booze of the world had taught these globe-trotting carousers anything, it was that this sweet molasses goo was perfect for fermenting. Early single-stage fermentations of molasses to produce a sort of molasses beer made pretty terrible tasting stuff, and I'll talk more about that in the 18th century. But distilling out the alcohol, concentrating the spirit of the drink, as was said, could make it into something entirely different and more potent. As I talked about back in beer and cider, while much of it was small daily stuff, even the strongest brews topped out in the mid-teens for ABV. And even the most potent wines didn't contain enough alcohol to stop Acetobacter and other bacteria from setting up shop, souring these brews and ruining them as party fodder. But when distillation entered the scene, among other things it could do, it reduced the water ratio to the ethyl alcohol and kept out the party-pooping single-cell organisms. I really want to go in on distillation, its history, and how to do it, but I see, as with soap, it's interesting as heck, but off the track. So you have another bonus episode I owe you. But for our purposes now, distillation is some really cool physical chemistry, and it is going to change molasses from an annoying waste goo to a moneymaker that becomes a major thorn in the side of the mercantilism cheerleaders. See episode 11. As sugar production ramped up, shipping ramped up, and the international slave shipments ramped up, along with all the financial arrangements and increased trade goods and markets, the distilled spirits market in North America was also about to change. Now, distillation in the West required some pretty intense metal crafty skills. The pot still that became the distillation go-to in Western Europe and North America was a rounded vessel and required tubes and pipes and all sorts of things that meant it would only be available to the sort of person who could purchase skillfully wrought metal objects with smooth curves and small tubes. This also meant distilled alcohols were relatively expensive and under the control of people who could pull together the capital to purchase one of these stills. Though a technology and resource challenge, distillation was pursued over and over and perfected over time. For distilled ethyl alcohol, or ethanol, became a contender for what alchemists called the quintessence, that fifth element sort of above, beyond, yet around those four essential elements, water, earth, air, and fire, that I mentioned all the way back in my medical primer. For it was a liquid that was not water, and it burned as fire. It quickly evaporated into air, and possibly most magical of all, it stopped the rot of earthly things, flesh and fruits. Thus, early distilled alcohols were called aquavitae, eau de vie, whiskey, which are each Latin, French, and Gaelic for water of life. The priciness of Western European distillation also meant distilled liquors had to pay. So many of the same forces driving the other money makers of the century, like wool cloth, cod, sugar, salt, and tobacco, would shape the distilled liquors market as well, which meant for most of the century, the liquor made from molasses would be focused on potency and quantity. Palatability and ensuring that it did not contain enough methyl alcohol to kill or maim were lower priorities. This initially unnamed fiery liquor was first generally known as Kill Devil, and then somewhere in the 18th century, everyone was calling it rum. The process of changing its name to rum is another thing that happened in the oral culture of the period. So the hows and exactly when it happened are all lost, but we have the letters, diaries, and shipping manifests that bracket the change. There is speculation that it made the drinker rumbustious and caused a rumbunction and other similar words of up to no goodedness. And that's where the word rum came from. But like many other word launderings and neologisms, the specific moment escapes us and, in the end, isn't essential. What does matter is that molasses went from a sweet but annoying waste goo to the basis for a profitable sideline and chorus of the pirate theme song. How did that all happen? Yo ho ho and a bottle of rum, after all. As I said before, by the 17th century, everyone who got around much knew sweet stuff could be made into boozy stuff. That was no puzzle. So there were surely experiments, illicit and purposeful, with the molasses to make a basic sort of beer. Making a slurry with molasses and tossing in a few pieces of lightly rotted fruit would be enough to inoculate the mixture with yeast and get the process rolling. The ambient temperature on the sugar islands would be perfect for getting a nice little ferment bubbling along. But molasses lacks any tempting secondary flavors to go with the alcohol. Things like apples, grapes, barley, honey, and even nice sugar cane juice all have other flavors besides just the straight sugar they bring to the mixture. So the resulting wines, ciders, beer, and meads, etc., have flavors that are enjoyable. Molasses has little or no additional flavors that are pleasant outside its sweetness, so the resulting primary fermentation product, a sort of molasses beer, tasted rather awful. Distillation would remove most of the heavy, bitter, mineral-y flavors. Also, sugar plantation owners and overseers were not above adding caustics like lye or ash, or simply pissing in molasses to deny it as extra calories or a sweet treat for the enslaved workers on the sugar islands. But the ferment and then the distillation of the molasses beer would remove most of these deterring taints. And after you were all done, you had a medicine and an alcoholic bonanza that sailors and soon any importer would pay top dollar for. The Dutch up in New Amsterdam were already great distillers of gin from back home. So the ones who remained through the regime change to New York were some of the first North Americans who had what it took to start distilling molasses. Newport, Rhode Island followed suit and was a major molasses importer and a rum distiller by the 1660s. Boston, with its whaling and cod fishing traditions, became a hub of rum distillation and consumption. This incidentally transported the molasses goo pollution problem from the islands to New England. The same amazement at the dark, sticky dead zones in waterways moved with the molasses. But the Sugar Islands didn't give up all the distilling. Many a liquor merchant noted that letting the rum travel in barrels in the heat and agitation of a voyage actually produced a smoother, less kill-devil-y liquor. And of course, the sugar merchants were more than happy to see a higher value product that saved them on barrels, as well as one that didn't attract rats and bugs the way molasses did. So rum, as an island drink, and particularly a drink of the Sugar Islands, as a premium version, was born. In fact, Mount Gay is a rum brand from Barbados that has been selling under that name since 1703. But a large-scale still had been in operation on that hill, or mount, if you will, since at least 1663. The grain-strapped colonists, tired of cornstalk beer and pumpkin beer and other not-grain beer, were excited to have a different tipple that was a lot less work and could be mixed with things like tea and cider and just even water. In fact, rum consumption was even encouraged by some locales to leave more grain for eating as bread and mushes and for export to England. Rum was also seen as a stand-in for the prohibitively expensive wine. Up until Queen Elizabeth's time, Atlantic weather patterns seemed to have made grape growing somewhat possible in the more temperate parts of England. But a shift in climate and winds caused the air currents that keep the British Isles habitable to alter a bit. And this whole thing was helped along, some think, by some pesky giant volcanic eruptions. Anyway, by the 17th century, there was no more grape growing of any note in England, and the repeated fighting with the French and Spanish put a serious dent in British grape wine supplies. But never fear, the mixing of sailor cultures to the rescue. What was known then as Paunch, or the Hindustani Five, was a seaside and then soon a gentleman's smoky clubroom hit. It was tea, water, sugar, lemon, and arrack. And the arrack used here, spelled A-R-A-K, was liquor made by brewing sugar cane juice, typically fresh and uncooked, unlike sugar syrup or molasses, and then distilled. And this recipe reminds me, shudder, of the energy drink everything trend when a Red Bull and vodka was a thing. And Budweiser and some lesser-known beers started putting caffeine in beers for a hot second around 2006. It was a bad idea then, and it was a bad idea at the dawn of the 21st century. And I have been informed there is now boozy Mountain Dew. It's still a terrible idea. Seriously, it's best when people get sleepy after drinking too much. Do not keep them up to do stupid and progressively more dangerous stuff for longer. But I'm sure for enough money, we will repeat it again. The upshot is, what would come to be called punch would become the fashionable drink of the clubby set, and the earliest version of what would burst on the scene as the daiquiri in the 20th century had arrived. Because no one who was anyone would drink that kill devil or that rum straight. It was pretty harsh. However, lots of nobodies who were no one did drink rum straight. In fact, rum in the 17th century had quite a few things in common with meth in the 20th and 21st centuries. It was the drug of choice for many unfancy people. There was lots of money made by smuggling it into different countries. Poor quality and adulterated versions of it were sold to unwitting people who died consuming it. And according to James E. McWilliams in his book, A Revolution in Eating, there were people that would home ferment and then crudely home distill rum, which would often have fatal consequences, just as with homemade meth. The details of the various ways one could die from this foolhardy home distillation venture will be detailed chemically in the distillation bonus episode. But the main way rum did people in was just by it being so very, very highly alcoholic. Most people in the 17th century were used to drinks with ABVs ranging from 3% to a high of 12-ish%. You could drink a big old bucket of sweet, low-alcohol cider and feel no ill effects except for, a very full belly. But rums typically range from around 35 to 60% ABV. There was no way to directly test alcohol percentage before the 19th century. It was all indirect and had to do with lighting things on fire. So anyway, a pint tankard of straight rum, that's about 2 cups, could do terrible things to you. At best, you were very sick. From there, the bad things that might happen to you included getting robbed or impressed into the Navy, the merchant service, sold into indenture, or simply perishing by getting run over by a carriage, falling off the quayside, or from alcohol poisoning or adulterants in the rum. All of this finally gets us to what role did rum play in 17th century food. As something that shared table space with food, rum was pretty limited. It would appear as punch or as a sipping drink in men's clubs, but that was usually away from food, unless it was with whatever people were eating at card tables before the Earl of Sandwich got all naming rightsy. The sailor on leave might have a tot of tavern rum with his stew, and it's possible that colonial families who were short on beer and cider might drink a diluted version with a meal, but that wouldn't have been very common. Where rum did affect food was in making money for molasses and rum importers, rum smugglers, and rum distillers. Along with cod fortunes in New England and tobacco and salt beef fortunes in Virginia, rum fortunes were being made. This increased the importing of European delicacies like raisins, spices, oil, tea, coffee, and chocolate. The money to run and support merchant houses brought more of Europe to the colonial kitchen. The need or desire to learn about and develop local crops was further diminished by the hunger for and the money to be made importing the European diet. The separation from foods native to the American continent was intensified by what the introduction of a relatively cheap distilled liquor did to trade relationships with the Native Americans. While whiskey and eau de vie did play a part and cause trouble early on in the negotiations and trading with the local tribes, the cheaper rum turned up the volume. Not as much as the home-brewed corn, wheat, and rye liquors will in the 18th century, and that is when I will dive into all that. Rum is still rare right now, and it isn't yet a major player there. But for the colonists, especially the English colonists in and around towns, well, many of them were definitely drunk and on the demon rum. Many were also up in arms, but some were making lots of money. And just as in the societies those early religious separatists were running from, money was papering over lots of problems, even with those like Increase and Cotton Mather, who were staunchly anti-intoxication. Some things, well, don't seem to change that much, even when you cross oceans. Most of us are swayed one way or another by money. And speaking of money, there wasn't much of it in the 17th century colonies. Barter was much more the order of the day. We've talked about some things that were used in place of money. Rum for sure, and tobacco, enslaved people, cows, deer hides, aka buckskins, metal objects, and so on. But there was one thing everyone was willing to lay down cash for, or treat as a money stand-in: spices. That's what I will be talking about next week. They were much beloved, much missed, and used in quantities when available that don't even seem reasonable or possible now. Prince Henry will get his last mention of the season, and I will say nutmeg so many times you'll think you're listening to the Townsend's YouTube channel. Thanks for listening. All right, it looks like, not counting the 2 bonus episodes I need to do, there will be just 4 more regular episodes until the end of the season. That means just 4 more weeks until the end of season 1/question show at the start of March. And I promise that as soon as I outline the last topic, I'll let you know if that will be March 2nd or March 9th. Whichever it is, it means you still have time to send me questions. Ask me about something I glossed over too fast or overlooked entirely. You can drop any questions on my Twitter, in my email, or even on the Facebook page if that's the place you're most comfortable. I look forward to your questions before we dive into the 18th century. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference, and it helps me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio, @THOA Food, and in the show description.